The temperature had been below zero for 4 days straight when Nora Whitfield found the eggs. She wasn't looking for them. She was behind Calhoun's feed and grain at 6:15 in the morning, which was earlier than any of the regulars came by, because she had been awake since 4, and there was nothing left to do in the house, and she needed the walk. She needed the cold air and the dark and the specific kind of quiet that exists in a small Missouri town before anyone starts their car. She needed the particular combination of physical discomfort and open sky that had helped her through harder mornings than this one. And this morning was not even especially hard. It was just the kind of morning that accumulated on top of other mornings until a person found herself outside at 6:15 in the dead of January. The eggs were in a broken wooden flat behind the green dumpster, stacked in 2 layers, some of them already cracked from where the flat had been dropped. They were duck eggs, the big, pale greenish-white kind that Calhoun's carried as a specialty item for the county's small backyard duck operations. The kind that sat in the refrigerated case in the back of the store until they were too old to sell, and then got pulled from the shelf and tossed without much ceremony. 280, she would count later. She did not count them then. What she did first was pick one up and hold it. She was wearing her old Army field gloves, the ones she'd kept because they were better than anything she'd been able to find at a civilian sporting goods store, and she held the egg through the gloves and felt the weight of it. And then she pulled the glove off her right hand and held the egg against the palm of her bare hand and stood very still in the dark behind the feed store. The egg was frozen solid on the outside, cold, smooth, perfectly inert, the way something dead is inert. But that wasn't what she felt. What she felt was a slight, not warmth, not exactly warmth, a resistance, a quality of not yet dead that was different from the quality of cold stone, or cold concrete, or cold ground. She had felt this distinction before, in other contexts, and she had learned not to dismiss it. She held the egg for a long moment. Then she put it carefully in her coat pocket and started going through the rest of the flat. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Nora Whitfield had been back in Calhoun Crossing for 14 months. She'd come back the way people come back to the towns they grew up in when they've run out of other options, which is to say, not triumphantly. The apartment in Fayetteville had been too expensive after the separation from the Army. The job prospects in Fayetteville had been not terrible, but not enough to offset the expense and the isolation and the particular way that Fayetteville felt like a place she was staying rather than a place she was living. Her grandmother, Martha Whitfield, was 81 and had been asking her to come back for 3 years, not in the sense of demanding it, but in the particular way elderly people mention things repeatedly until the person they're mentioning them to finally understands the actual urgency beneath the lightness of tone. Nora had come back in November of the year before last. She was 34. The old farmhouse on the county road was 12 acres, which was not enough to be a real farming operation by any modern measure, but was enough to qualify as something more than a lawn. Martha had kept chickens into her late 70s and had stopped only when the coop needed repairs that she couldn't manage alone, and the chickens that died had not been replaced. The coop was still standing, repaired now, because Nora had repaired it in her first month back, but standing empty. The farmhouse itself was fine, old, but fine. The barn needed a roof section replaced, which Nora had done in the fall. The fencing along the back property line was inadequate, and she'd been replacing it section by section through the autumn, before winter made the ground too hard to drive posts. She had been sleeping poorly since March of the year before she came home. Not badly enough to be clinical, which was a phrase she had heard too many times in too many offices. Badly enough to be awake at 6:15 on a January morning, with nowhere better to be than behind a feed store. She worked through the flat for 40 minutes in the dark and the cold. She had a small LED flashlight on her keychain, the kind she carried for the same reason she carried a pocket knife, and always knew which door in a given room was the exit, because being prepared for minor inconveniences was a habit so deeply built into her that she could no more stop doing it than she could stop breathing. She used the flashlight to look at each egg before she held it, checking for the kind of catastrophic cracking that would mean the membrane was compromised, and then she held each one against her bare palm for a slow count of 30, long enough to feel whatever there was to feel. Most were stone cold in the way of things that were finished. These she set aside gently, back into the broken flat. But not all of them. She found 31 eggs that were different, not warm, not alive in any confirmable sense, but not finished in the way the others were finished. There was something in each one, a quality of the cold that was holding rather than settling, something she recognized without being able to name it precisely. She put them in the insulated bag she'd brought to carry coffee home. She hadn't thought about what she was doing in terms of a plan, because she didn't have a plan yet. She had the eggs and the cold and the beginning of a question. She walked home in the dark and thought about it. Martha was up when she got back, which was not surprising because Martha had been getting up before sunrise for 80 years and was not going to change that now. And she was standing at the kitchen stove, making eggs that were from the grocery store and scrambled in the same pan she had been using for scrambling eggs since approximately 1974. Nora set the insulated bag on the kitchen table. Martha looked at it and looked at Nora. "What did you bring home?" Martha said. "Duck eggs from behind Calhoun's." "From the dumpster," Martha said. "From behind the dumpster. They were in a flat that got dropped. Maybe 280 total, but I only brought 31. Martha set down the spatula and came to the table and looked at the bag without opening it. "Why 31?" she said. "Those were the ones that aren't finished yet," Nora said. Martha looked at her with an expression that was not skepticism and was not certainty. It was the expression of a woman who had been on a farm for 81 years and understood that there were things you could not know ahead of time, and that the process of finding out was the only option. "You need to get them warm," Martha said. "Not too fast." "I know." "The cellar," Martha said. "It runs about 54 degrees right now. Put them there first and let them come up gradually." "That was my thought." "And you'll need proper humidity. Duck eggs need more humidity than chickens." "I know." "Do you know how to build a brooder?" Martha asked. "I know how to build most things," Nora said. Martha picked up the spatula and went back to her eggs. "Then build a brooder," she said. "And if you need me, I'll be here." The town learned about it, because the town always learned about things. At the feed store itself, Calvin Pruitt, who worked the counter and had been working the counter since before Nora was born, mentioned to the first customer of the morning that he'd noticed the broken flat was gone from behind the dumpster when he unlocked the back gate, and the first customer of the morning was a man named Dale Horton, who knew Nora's neighbor, and by noon it had made its way through the informal circulation system of a small town in a way that these things always did, with accuracy of detail that varied considerably depending on who was doing the telling. What was consistent? Nora Whitfield, who had come back from the army a little different than she went, had taken frozen cracked duck eggs from behind the feed store dumpster and was trying to hatch them. The consensus was immediate and absolute. Frozen eggs don't hatch. Gary Calhoun, who ran the feed store with his father and who had a forthright opinion on most topics, said it at the counter when someone asked him directly, "Frozen eggs don't hatch." That's not opinion, that's biology. Once an egg freezes through, the development stops. You can't restart it. Those eggs are done. He was not unkind about it. He said it the same way he would say that a particular brand of chicken feed was not available anymore, as a simple factual statement. "She seems to think otherwise," the customer said. "She can think whatever she wants," Gary said. "The eggs will let her know." At the grain co-op, two older farmers discussed it briefly. "Frozen means frozen," said the first. "That's always been true," said the second. "There's science behind that. There is. A brief pause. Girl just got home from the service, the first said. I know. Sometimes that takes some time. They left it there, which was about as much gentleness as that particular conversation was going to produce. Nora did not hear these conversations directly. She heard the general shape of them secondhand, through Calvin Pruitt, who seemed to feel some responsibility toward her, given that it was technically his store's discarded eggs she was working with, and who stopped by 3 days after the fact to let her know what was being said and to offer his honest opinion, which he delivered with the directness of a man who respected her, enough not to soften it. Gary says, frozen eggs don't hatch. He says you'd know that if you'd kept livestock. I've kept livestock, Nora said. I grew up here. That's what I told him. What did he say? He said, okay, maybe, but still. Nora didn't answer that. I want to ask you something, Calvin said, and you can tell me it's none of my business. Ask. Were they actually frozen? Actually, the eggs you brought back. Nora thought about this carefully, with the same precision she applied to the question of which eggs she'd selected and why. Some of them were frozen solid all the way through, she said. Those I left. The ones I brought back were cold enough that the outsides were hard, but they held differently. There's a quality to something that isn't quite finished yet, that's different from something that's done. I've felt the difference before. Calvin looked at her for a moment. I believe you know the difference you're talking about, he said. I do. I hope you're right about the eggs. I might not be, Nora said, but I have to find out. The brooder she built over the next 3 days was rough but functional, which described most of the things she built, and which she had decided years ago was the appropriate standard for things meant to work rather than to be admired. She used lumber from the barn loft that her grandfather had stored up there in the 1980s, and that had never been used for anything but was still sound. She built a box, 4 feet by 4 feet, with hardware cloth on 3 sides and a solid wood back wall, a hinged lid that opened to allow egg turning and inspection, and a mounting system for the heat lamp that let her adjust the height and angle without tools. She insulated the interior walls with rigid foam, cut from a sheet she'd found in the barn, which was more than strictly necessary, but which she had decided to include because the Missouri January was serious, and the difference between adequate and good in early incubation was something she did not want to test. The temperature control was the critical thing, and she knew it. Duck eggs needed 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit at egg level for the first 25 days, then slightly cooler in the final 3 days of lockdown before hatching. She set up a thermometer at egg level, not at standing height where it was typically 5 to 10 degrees warmer, and adjusted the lamp height until she had the temperature stable and correct. She added a shallow dish of water for humidity, which duck eggs needed at higher levels than chicken eggs. She checked it twice a day and added water when the level dropped. She put the eggs in the brooder on day 3. She had a notebook she'd been keeping since she got back, the same composition book she'd been using to track what she was doing with the property, the fence repairs and the roof work, and the small mechanical problems that accumulated in an old farmhouse. She added a section for the eggs. Day 1 of incubation, she wrote at the top of the page, and below it, she recorded the temperature, the humidity, the time she'd started the lamp, and a description of each egg, its size, any visible cracks, the color of the shell, anything she'd noticed when she handled it that had made her set it aside rather than leave it in the flat. She turned the eggs 3 times a day, 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 at night. She set alarms on her phone for the noon turn because she was likely to be outside and might not hear the kitchen clock. She did not miss a single turn. The first candling was on day 7. She had driven to the farm supply store in the next county because Calhoun's didn't carry candlers, and she had bought a small LED model that cost $14 and was designed for exactly this purpose. She set up the brooder in the darkened laundry room at night, waited until the house was fully dark, and went through the eggs one at a time, holding each one against the candler's light and turning it slowly. She was looking for two things: an air cell at the large end of the egg, clearly defined, and the web of blood vessels that indicated a developing embryo. She had read about what to expect at day 7 and had watched several videos on her phone over the previous week, pausing and rewinding the parts about candling, until she felt confident she knew what she was looking at. The first egg showed nothing: a clear, translucent glow with no visible structure. She set it aside. The second egg was the same. The third had something. It was faint enough that she held the candler steady and looked for a full 30 seconds before deciding what she was seeing was real and not her own hope projected onto the light. A dark central mass and, radiating from it, barely visible, the beginnings of a vascular pattern. She set it in the row she was keeping for the viable ones. She went through all 31. 14 showed development. She sat in the laundry room in the dark after she was done and stayed there for a while without moving. 14 out of 31. More than half the remaining eggs had continued developing in the brooder. These were eggs that had been frozen through a 4-day cold snap of below zero temperatures. Eggs that the feed store had thrown away because they were unsellable. Eggs that the town had unanimously agreed were done. 14 were not done. She went back to the kitchen and added the results to the notebook. Day 7 candling, she wrote. 14 confirmed developing. 17 cleared. 14 remaining in brooder. Below that she wrote, more than I expected. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table, and Martha came down in her robe because she was 81, and her bladder was 81 too, and she saw Nora sitting at the table at midnight. How many? Martha said. 14. Martha sat down across from her. Out of 31, Martha said. Yes. That's almost half. Almost half. Martha looked at her. Your grandfather would have had something to say about that, she said. What would he have said? Nora asked. Martha thought about it. He would have said that the land remembers things that people forget, Martha said. And then he would have gone back to bed and not talked about it again for 3 days. Nora almost smiled. Go to bed, Martha said. I will. Good night. Good night, Grandma. The conversations in town shifted register at day 7, in the way that small-town conversations shift when the confirmed information changes, but the social dynamics make it complicated to simply admit that the initial consensus was wrong. Calvin Pruitt mentioned the 14 eggs at the counter when someone brought up the subject. She said 14 showed development on day 7, Calvin said. That's not possible, Gary Calhoun said. He had stopped in to pick up a part for a feed mixer. She candled them. That's what she saw. She's new to this. She probably doesn't know what she's looking at. Nora grew up on a farm, Calvin said. A farm with duck eggs? Maybe not. But she's not a fool, Gary. Gary was quiet for a moment. 14 doesn't mean 14 hatch, he said finally. Development at day 7 doesn't mean anything yet. They could still die off. That's true, Calvin said. She said the same thing. She said that? She said day 7 doesn't mean much yet. She said she'd know more at day 14. Gary bought his part and left without commenting further, which in Gary was roughly equivalent to someone else expressing interest. The day 14 candling was harder, not because the results were bad, because she went into it with more at stake than she'd had at day 7, which was the opposite of the scientific detachment she'd intended to maintain, and which was something she wrote about in the notebook with the same directness she applied to everything else she wrote about. Day 14 candling, she wrote. Going in with more attachment than is useful. Trying to be accurate about what I see, rather than what I want to see. This is harder than it should be for something that is technically just eggs. She went through all 14 remaining eggs. 11 showed continued development. The vascular network was much more visible now, dense and complex, and in 3 of the eggs she could see movement. The embryo itself, shifting slightly in response to the light, or to being handled. The unmistakable animation of something alive. 3 had stopped at some point in the past week. She could tell from the ring of blood at the air cell boundary, the telltale sign of what the incubation books called quitters. She removed them without ceremony and added them to the notebook. 11 remained. 11 duck eggs that had been frozen in a broken flat behind a feed store on a January night below zero, thrown away by a business as unsalvageable waste, were alive at day 14 and showing clear, healthy, continued development. Nora sat with this for a long time. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote, Day 14 candling. 11 confirmed, strong development. 3 quitters removed. 11 in lockdown prep beginning day 25. Movement visible in 3. These are real. She underlined the last 2 words. Not as an exclamation, but as a factual correction to the general civic consensus of the previous 2 weeks. Calvin Pruitt heard about the day 14 results and mentioned them at the counter. And this time, the conversation traveled differently than the day 7 news had. 14 viable eggs at day 7 was a curiosity, something that might be explained by inexperience with candling, or wishful thinking, or the particular kind of optimism that sometimes accompanied people who'd been through something hard and needed to believe in improbable things. 11 at day 14, with visible movement in 3 of them, was harder to dismiss on those grounds. Gary Calhoun heard about it and said nothing for a full 30 seconds before responding, which was unusual for Gary. Movement, he finally said. That's what Calvin said she told him. Movement means what exactly? It means she saw the embryo moving inside the shell when she held it up to the light. Gary was quiet again. Okay, he said. Okay. That was all he said. But he stopped saying anything to the contrary at the feed store after that. And in a small town, stopping saying things was its own kind of statement. Lockdown started on day 25. Nora stopped turning the eggs. She raised the humidity to 72% by adding a second shallow water dish and a folded damp cloth to the brooder. She stopped opening the lid except to check the humidity level through the observation port she'd built into the side. She lowered the heat lamp a half-inch to cool the brooder slightly, to the temperature the incubation materials specified for the final days. She sat in the chair she'd moved next to the brooder and read. She was rereading a book she'd first read during a deployment, a novel she'd carried in her pack, because it was thin, and because someone she trusted had said it was worth the wait. And she was finding, on this second reading, that it was an entirely different book than she remembered, which she understood was the usual way of things, but that still surprised her. On day 27, she heard the first pip. It was quiet, quieter than she'd expected. A small, dry tapping from inside the shell of the egg she'd been thinking of as number 3, the one in the 3rd position in the back row, the one she'd chosen almost arbitrarily from the ones in the flat that morning, and that had been the first she noticed movement in at the day 14 candling. She put the book down and knelt next to the brooder. The tapping came again. Not a continuous sound. Intermittent, effortful. The sound of something working at a task that was hard, and that it was doing anyway. She sat next to the brooder for the next 4 hours. By the time she went to bed at midnight, number 3 had made a small hole in the shell, less than the size of a pencil eraser, and she could see through it a sliver of wet, dark gray feather and something that was moving. Day 28 produced 5 ducklings. Not all at once, not cleanly, not the way things looked in videos. The hatching was gradual and effortful, and each bird took its own time, and Nora did not help any of them, because the incubation resources were consistent on this point, and she had decided to follow the established guidance on the subject rather than her own impulse, which would have been to assist the ones that seemed to be struggling. Number 3 was out by 4 in the morning, wet, dark gray, its down plastered flat against its body, lying on its side in the brooder breathing hard. By noon, there were 3. By 5 in the evening, there were 5. She didn't call anyone. She wrote in the notebook. She turned the heater up slightly, per the instructions, to keep the newly hatched birds warm. She checked the water dish. She added a second thermometer to monitor the temperature more precisely. Day 29 brought 4 more. Day 30, the last 2 hatched within an hour of each other, as though they had been waiting for some signal or permission that finally arrived. 9 ducklings in total, out of 11 eggs that had made it to lockdown, out of 14 that had shown development at day 7, out of 31 that she'd pulled from the cold behind the feed store, out of 280 frozen cracked eggs that Gary Calhoun's store had thrown away as unsalvageable waste. 9. She wrote it in the notebook. Then she sat at the kitchen table and Martha came in and looked at the 9 small, dry, increasingly fluffy, gray and yellow birds in the brooder, and didn't say anything for a while. 9, Nora said, because saying it out loud seemed important. I heard them cheeping from my room, Martha said. I thought I was dreaming. You weren't. No, Martha said. I wasn't. She looked at the ducklings for a long time. Your grandfather, she said, and then she stopped. What? Nora said. He would have been pleased, Martha said simply. He always liked it when something came back that everyone had said was gone. By the time word got around Calhoun Crossing that Nora Whitfield had hatched 9 ducklings from frozen feed store eggs, the town's response had evolved from the original unified certainty through the subsequent stages of uncertainty and arrived at something more complicated. The kind of complicated that small communities reach when a person they've sorted into one category does something that doesn't fit that category. Gary Calhoun came by himself. He didn't call ahead. He drove out on a Thursday morning, parked his truck in the drive, came to the door, and stood there with his hat in his hands in the cold. And Nora brought him into the kitchen where the brooder was set up on the counter, the 9 ducklings making the particular sound that ducklings make, which is halfway between a peep and a chirp, and which, once you've heard it, becomes one of those sounds that seems impossible to have never heard before. He looked at them for a long time without saying anything. He was a practical man, Gary Calhoun. He had grown up in this county, and his father had grown up in this county, and the family had operated Calhoun's Feed and Grain for 3 generations. And in 3 generations you accumulated a lot of data about what was possible and what was not. And that data became a kind of knowledge that was mostly correct and useful, and that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, turned out to be wrong. He looked at the 9 ducklings. He looked at Nora. Frozen eggs don't hatch, he said. Apparently some of them do, Nora said. Gary was quiet. Not frozen solid, he said finally. Not like that flat was. Not after 4 days below 0. That's what I thought too, Nora said. But I held them, and some of them weren't finished. The ones that weren't finished, I tried. And 9 hatched. 9. Gary put his hat on the kitchen table and sat down across from the brooder and watched the ducklings for a while. 2 of them were preening. 1 was asleep. 1 was peering at Gary with the entirely fearless curiosity that very young birds had before they'd learned anything about the world. My father would have said to leave them, Gary said. He would have said you were wasting your time. My grandmother said I needed to warm them up gradually. Your grandmother knows livestock. She does. She didn't tell you to leave them. She told me to build a brooder. Gary was quiet for another moment. What are you going to do with them? He said. Keep them, mostly. The 12 acres here have a pond. If I can build a proper pen and a shelter, they'll work the property. They'll eat the insects and the invasive aquatic plants, and they'll produce eggs. Martha likes duck eggs. 12 acres, Gary said. That's enough to run a small laying operation if you go up to 30 or 40 birds. I know. I have stock that might be useful, Gary said slowly, in the tone of a man making an offer he hadn't planned to make when he pulled out of his driveway that morning. We carry hatching eggs from a local supplier, not the frozen dumpster kind, properly managed. I know you do, Nora said. I've been in your store. Right, Gary said. Of course. A pause. "I'd sell them to you at my cost," Gary said. Given the circumstances. Nora looked at him. He was not a man who admitted being wrong easily. She could see that it cost him something, this offer, and she appreciated it in the way she appreciated most things that cost someone something honest. "I'd take you up on that," she said. Gary picked up his hat and stood up. "I'll let you know when the next shipment comes in," he said. He looked at the 9 ducklings one more time before he went. 9, he said quietly, not quite to himself and not quite to Nora. "From that flat." "From that flat," Nora confirmed. He nodded once, put his hat on, and left. The pen took 3 weeks to build. Nora worked on it in the mornings before the temperature climbed, which in January meant she was outside in the dark for the first hour most days, working by headlamp in the cold, driving posts into ground that had thawed enough on the surface to work, but was still hard enough underneath to make every post a project. Caleb, the 16-year-old from the property down the road, whose father she'd helped with a fencing problem in the fall, started showing up on Saturdays without being asked, ostensibly because he was curious about the ducks, but actually, Nora suspected, because he was at that age where having somewhere purposeful to be on a Saturday morning was worth more than the purpose itself. She let him work and taught him things as the opportunities came up, the way her grandfather had taught her, not in the sense of formal instruction, but in the sense of doing a thing correctly and letting whoever was watching draw whatever conclusions they could. The pen was solid. The shelter was solid. The pond on the east end of the property, when the ice finally broke in March, was small, but deep enough and clear enough from where Nora had cleared the invasive vegetation along the bank the previous fall. The 9 ducklings, grown now into awkward adolescent ducks with their adult feathers coming in and their voices changing from peeps to the first low quacks, found the pond on their first day out and went into it with the enthusiasm of creatures who had been designed for exactly this purpose and had only just discovered it. Nora stood at the bank and watched them. She had been sleeping better for about 3 weeks. Not perfectly. Not the deep, full, uninterrupted sleep that she thought of as normal, but that she suspected she would not experience again for some time yet, if ever. But better. The noon alarms for egg turning had helped, actually, in a way she hadn't anticipated. They had given her days that had structure in the middle of them, a reason to be somewhere at a specific time for a specific purpose that was entirely disconnected from any of the difficult things. And the early mornings in the cold, working on the pen or just walking, had done the thing they were supposed to do, which was wear the body out enough that sleep felt less like a battle. She didn't think about this too analytically. She just noted it in the notebook, in the matter-of-fact register she used for the temperature readings and the candling results and the post count in the new fence line. Sleep improvement, she wrote. Attributable unclear. Possible contributors. Physical work, routine, the particular quality of being responsible for something alive. She looked at the ducks in the pond for a while. Then she added, also possibly just time. Hard to separate the variables. Gary Calhoun's hatching eggs arrived in March, a dozen of them from the local supplier he'd mentioned, and Nora built a second, slightly larger brooder and ran a second incubation with the proper tools and the proper setup and the accumulated knowledge of a first attempt. She lost 2 in the first week, and 1 failed to hatch at lockdown. 9 more ducklings. Combined with the original 9, who were now fully grown, the flock was 18. You need more than that for a real laying operation, Gary told her when she stopped in for oyster shell. I know, she said. I'm building up slowly. That's a reasonable approach. He said this without any particular emphasis, but she noticed he said it, and she thought probably he meant it as the simple acknowledgement it sounded like. She bought another dozen hatching eggs. By the second autumn, the flock was 34. Not quite the 40 Nora had originally considered sufficient for a small laying operation, but close, and the remaining gap was closing with each new hatch. The duck eggs she was selling, to Martha's friends, to a small local restaurant that had heard about them through a cousin of Calvin Pruitt's wife, to the Saturday farmers market in the county seat, where she'd taken a table starting in June, were going faster than she could supply them. She wrote this in the notebook without celebration, the way she recorded most things, as a fact about the current situation, rather than a judgment on what the situation meant. Martha, who was now 82, and who had grown to understand the operation better than anyone else in Nora's life, asked her one evening in September what she thought was going to happen next. "I think the flock reaches 60 by spring if the next hatch goes well," Nora said. "That's not what I asked," Martha said. Nora looked at her. "I know," she said. "What are you going to do with yourself?" Martha said. "Not just with the ducks." Nora thought about this honestly. "I think I'm going to stay," she said. "I don't think that's always been what I planned, but I think it is now." "Good," Martha said. "Because of the farm?" Martha shook her head slowly. "Because this is where things grow for you," Martha said. "Some people find that in one place and some find it in another. Some people never find it at all. You seem to have found it here. Not everyone does." Nora thought about the 6:15 walk in January, the cold and the dark and the broken flat behind the green dumpster, the 31 eggs she'd selected and the quality she'd felt in 14 of them that she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't already understood it, the 14 candles that showed 11, the 9 cheeping birds in a kitchen brooder on a below-zero morning when the town had already decided nothing was going to come of any of it. "I found 9 eggs that everyone said were done," she said. "You found 31, Martha corrected. 14 were what you thought. 9 hatched. That's how it usually goes. Not everyone survives just because it's worth trying." She stood up slowly and went to put the kettle on. "But you don't know which ones until you try," she said over her shoulder. "That's the whole thing. You don't know until you try." The next January, Nora walked behind the feed store again. Not deliberately, not on purpose, just in the course of her usual early morning circuit of the town, which she still kept because she still needed the cold and the dark and the particular silence of a small Missouri town before anyone starts their car. The dumpster was the same dumpster. The fence was the same fence. Nothing was different except that she was, in whatever small ways, 12 months of work and watching and not sleeping well, and then sleeping somewhat better, added up to being a different person than the one who had stopped and picked up that first egg in the cold and held it in her bare hand and decided there was something there worth trying for. She stood for a moment and looked at the space behind the dumpster, which was empty this morning. Nothing in it but a cardboard box that had gotten wet and collapsed. Then she walked home. Martha had left coffee on. The 34 ducks were moving around the frozen pond, moving on the ice in the specific comical way that waterfowl moved on ice, without particular grace, but without apparent concern, doing what they did regardless of the conditions around them. Nora poured coffee and stood at the window and watched them. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was not doing anything except standing at the window, watching her ducks move on the ice of a pond on 12 acres in Missouri on a January morning, which was more than enough. The summer before that second January had been the first summer since her separation from the Army that Nora felt like she was building something rather than waiting for something to end. The distinction was subtle, and she couldn't have explained it precisely if anyone had asked. But she knew it in the way she knew the difference between the quality of cold in a finished egg and the quality of cold in one that wasn't finished yet. Not through analysis, through something in the body that recognized the difference before the mind had words for it. She had started keeping more detailed records as the flock grew. Not just the incubation notes, but records about the pond and the pasture, about what the ducks ate and where they ranged, and what effect 34 birds had on the small ecosystem of 12 acres over the course of a season. She recorded the decline of a particular invasive aquatic plant that had been spreading through the pond's shallower margins for years, apparently unchecked. She recorded the appearance of several frog species that Martha said she hadn't seen on the property in at least a decade. She recorded the way the pasture grass behind the barn was thicker and darker green in the sections where the ducks ranged most regularly, the result of manure deposited by animals who moved rather than being confined. "This is the right way to keep records," Martha told her once, when she found Nora's notebooks on the kitchen table. "How do you know what's the right way?" Nora said. "Your grandfather kept records like this," Martha said. "Not just the numbers, the patterns, the things that changed. Most people write down what they did. He wrote down what the land did." "Is that different?" Nora said. "It's very different," Martha said. "Most records are about the person. His were about the place. Yours are the same way." Nora thought about that for a few days. Caleb, the boy from down the road, became a more significant part of the operation as the second year progressed. He was 17 by the time autumn came around. A quiet, observant kid who had grown up watching his father struggle with a soybean operation that the economics of the county weren't really supporting anymore, and who had developed, through some combination of temperament and circumstance, the specific patience that useful work required. He was good with the birds. He understood them the way some people understand animals without formal instruction, through sustained attention paid over enough time, and the ducks had sorted him out as non-threatening within the first month, which was faster than they'd sorted out most people. "What are you going to do after high school?" Nora asked him one September afternoon, when they were building additional shelter for the flock before winter. He shrugged. "My dad wants me to go to agricultural school, to learn how to run the farm better." "What do you want?" Another shrug, this one more deliberate. "I don't know. I thought maybe I'd try the army." Nora kept working. She didn't look up from the board she was securing. "Why?" she said. "Because I want to do something real," he said. "Something that matters. On the farm, it always just feels like we're barely keeping up, like we're running in place." "The army might feel that way too," she said, still not looking up. "Depending." "You think I shouldn't go?" "I think you should go if it's what you want for the actual reasons you want it," she said. "And I think you shouldn't go if you're going because you can't figure out what else to do." She did look up then. "Both of those things feel the same from the inside until you're already doing it," she said. "Which is the problem?" Caleb thought about this. "Which one was it for you?" he asked. "Both, at different times," she said. "On the same enlistment." He was quiet for a while, the way people his age were quiet when they understood something, but were still working out what to do with it. "Did you know that those eggs were going to hatch?" he said finally, "when you brought them home?" Nora thought about the honest answer to this. "No," she said. "I thought some of them might. I didn't know which ones, and I didn't know if any of them would make it through the whole process. But I thought they weren't done. That was enough to try." "That's kind of what I thought about enlisting," he said. "Like, I don't know if it's the right thing, but I don't think I'm done figuring out what the right thing is." "Then you're probably in the right place to be making that decision," Nora said, "which is not the same as knowing what to decide." "That's not very helpful," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. I don't have a better answer than that." The farmer's market in the county seat had been the unexpected part. She had signed up in April on a practical basis, as a way to move eggs that her existing buyers couldn't absorb, and without any particular expectation that it would amount to much. She brought 24 duck eggs the first Saturday and sold them all by 9 in the morning. The second Saturday, she brought 24 and sold them by 10. The third Saturday, she brought 24 again and had people asking if she had more. "You're undersupplied," the woman at the adjacent table told her. This was a woman named Jan Holloway, who had been selling at the county market for 9 years, and who had the specific authority of a person who had seen enough markets go past to know what worked and what didn't. "Duck eggs are a specialty item, and there are very few local suppliers. You could charge more." "How much more?" Nora said. Jan named a number. Nora raised her price the following Saturday. She still sold out by 10:30. "I told you," Jan said. "You were right," Nora said. They became, over the following months, something like market friends, which was a particular category of friendship that existed between people who showed up in the same place, with the same purposes every week, through all kinds of weather, and shared the specific bond of people who took their work seriously and showed up for it regardless. Jan sold vegetables, and she sold them well, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of knowing exactly what she was selling and why it was good. She had a small operation herself, 7 acres outside the county seat, and she'd built it from nothing over about 12 years. "How do you do it?" Nora asked her one afternoon in June, when they were loading their unsold goods back into their respective vehicles after a long, hot market day. "Do what?" Jan said. "Make a real thing out of a small farm." Jan considered this. "I stopped trying to be big," she said. "When I first started, I was always looking at the big operations and trying to figure out how to compete. How to have more, produce more, sell more. I was always behind. And then I realized I wasn't supposed to be competing with them. I was supposed to be doing something different, something they couldn't do." "What's that?" "Connection," Jan said. "The people who buy from me at this market, they know where their food came from. They know my name. They know I'll be here next Saturday. That's not something you can buy from a distribution warehouse." Nora thought about this on the drive home. She thought about the 9 ducklings in the kitchen brooder in January, and the town that had said they were impossible, and the 9 people who bought duck eggs from her, now at the farmer's market every week. Some of them the same people, or the neighbors of the same people who had said the eggs were done. And she thought about the strange loop of it, the way things could come around from impossible to ordinary, without quite resolving the question of why they'd seemed impossible in the first place. She didn't have a name for that loop. She just knew that it existed. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told something they have isn't worth trying for. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever picked up something everyone said was finished and found out it wasn't. I want to hear that story. Every comment gets read.